Hi everybody, and welcome to a Heel Heat Top 10 show. My name is George Coles. This is my tag team partner, Crush.
Thanks everybody, Gary Rhodes.
And this episode's topic is Top 10 Wrestlers of the 1980s. This is our opinion on who we think were the biggest guys in the 80s, and I'll let you start off, Gary.
Well, number 10 had one of the best catchphrases of all time. It was also a G.I. Joe character, Sergeant Slaughter. The man main evented opposite venues other than Hogan. Hogan would main event at that point, we'll say they were all both in WWE, but Hogan would main event with we'll say Piper, where him and Sheik would main event. The Iron Sheik would main event another venue and still sell out.
He had great rivalries all throughout the 80s. First, he had a great tag team with Don Cornudel, rivalries against Iron Sheik, his rivalry with Pat Patterson is one of the absolute best of all time. Some of the most hard-hitting matches, even now, they hold up against the hardcore matches that have gone in since then, were the street fights that him and Pat Patterson would have with each other. A great wrestler, a great gimmick. He was the first, to touch on what you said, he was the first real-life person to get a G.I. Joe character made of him. And he headlined in WWE, AWA, came back at the beginning of the next decade and did his heel turn, but during the 80s, he was one of the biggest draws there was.
Oh, of course.
And speaking of draws, our number 9 guy was a huge draw in the Carolinas. That's not your drinking hand.
Oh.
Double A, he's double tough, Arn Anderson. One of the greatest tag team wrestlers of all time, let alone his single activity where he was a great singles wrestler as well.
One of the best television champions NWA or WCW ever had, too, I think.
Yes. I mean, the guy was solid. To paraphrase what he said in his retirement speech, if you seen Arn Anderson's name on a card, you know you were getting everything he had. And that's 100% true. The guy never mailed in a performance. I mean, he was spot on. You got a solid match out of Arn Anderson, whether he was wrestling Johnny B. Bad, Barry Horowitz, or Ric Flair. It didn't matter to him.
And I honestly think I've watched a lot of his matches, from even before I was born, like YouTube, stuff like that, and I've never seen the man green in the ring.
No. And he's 100%. There's no wasted motion. He's kind of a throwback, kind of the Harley Race style of wrestling. He's hell of a performer. Should have probably got a singles world title at some point, but never got that for whatever reason. Main event in NWA at the time, WCW, and WWF as part of the Brainbusters.
Number 8 is one of the best heels of all time during the 80s. Actually, even beyond that, he actually went to become a pretty decent manager. The $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. Everybody's got a price.
And even before he was the $1 Million Man, in the early 80s when he was wrestling in UWF in Bill Watts' Mid-South as just Ted DiBiase, he was a hell of a worker. The guy was, by far, I think they put the wrong guy over at WrestleMania 4. It should have been Ted that won the title, not Macho. I understand why Macho did, but, and I have no qualms about Macho being a champion.
He's one of our favorites.
Yeah, I love Macho Man, but Ted DiBiase was hotter than any other heel up until that point, including Piper was in WWF.
He had the thing is he could work and he could talk. Those are your two basics. But the man was just perfect in the ring. Like you said with Arn, he was fluid motion, no waste of anything. Everything meant something when he was in the ring.
And the $1 Million Dream was just devastating.
Oh, it was. And I love the fact that he had Virgil as a sidekick. And, the whole, after he put the $1 Million Dream on somebody, put him out.
Stuff the dollar.
And Virgil has come back and pull it out. Plus, he fucked with RVD when he was a kid.
There you go.
How can you beat that?
The next guy we're going to talk about was a guy who made it to high mid-card status. Our number 7 guy was Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. Started off the decade in a tag team with Jay Youngblood, wrestling for the U.S. title in the NWA against Ric Flair. Went on to have one of the best WrestleMania matches of all times against Macho Man Randy Savage at WrestleMania 3. Probably still holds up one of the 2 or 3 best matches ever. Ended out the decade becoming the NWA champion in another feud with Ric Flair. Again, probably the 4 best matches in the 1980s had Ricky Steamboat in.
Well, he's arguably the best babyface alive. Because, I mean, people would say Hulk Hogan was at one point, but Hogan turned heel. He's always been a babyface. And I think that's one thing that kind of worked against him.
He's one of the few wrestlers that stayed either face or heel their entire career. Steamboat, he had a tremendous following. I think the thing that hurt him in WWE or WWF at the time, was he wanted to take time off when his son was born, and Vince didn't want him to, but that's kind of why he lost I think he lost the Honky Tonk Man, the Intercontinental, didn't he? There were going to be bigger things for him, but Vince stopped that push when he wanted to take time off.
Well, number 6 is my favorite wrestler of all time, Mr. Perfect. I mean, what can you not say about the guy? You know, shoot-wise or whatever, the man could wrestle, he could talk, he was a perfect entertainer, and he lived up to his gimmick in the ring and out.
The thing of it was, and you're going to hate me for saying this, Mr. Perfect began the decade out as a jobber. He was an enhancement talent on WWF TV when he was young, in a tag team with Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert. Both of them were enhancement talents. Both of them went on to bigger careers later on. And he worked his way to the top. He didn't just rely on the fact that he was Larry the Axe-Heading's son. Yes, that got him jobs, but he proved that he was somebody different. First in the AWA, where he stood out like a sore thumb in a batch of great wrestlers. He was the cream of the crop. He was probably, and other people have said this, probably the greatest athlete to ever wrestle.
Oh yeah, and you know, like I said, I grew up idolizing Mr. Perfect. When other kids were like all the, you know, about the Hogans and, you know, all the other baby faces, there was something about Perfect. I really liked the way he kind of lived up to his gimmick. His vignettes were spot on, perfect. A matter of fact, he was so good, he would get nervous in the camera. They just leave the camera running the whole time because he would mess up if the camera was running.
Yeah.
They just wouldn't tell him.
And talking about great heels, our number 5 character, probably the guy who just as much as Hulk Hogan and Vince McMahon put the WWF on the map, Rowdy Roddy Piper. He was in the thing they did, what was it? I forget what it was called, the main event or the big event on MTV, which at the time was huge to have wrestling on MTV. MTV was probably the biggest thing to ever hit in the 80s. I mean, it was a phenomenon. And the Rock and Wrestling came in. He was, you know, wrestling with and against Cyndi Lauper, Hulk Hogan, Mr. T. I mean, he was the guy. He was like Austin Aries says now, he was the straw that stirred the drink. And his Piper's Pit was so influential that they're trying to stick anybody at Miz, the latest guy.
Yeah. You know, the thing is with Piper doesn't get the credit for WrestleMania 1 that he deserves.
No.
Everybody gives Hogan and McMahon the credit, which, you know, they are the two. But like
and
you said,
Mr. T.
And Mr. T, which Mr. T. But I mean, they always shadow over Roddy Piper. If it wasn't for Roddy Piper's actions, WrestleMania would never have been so big.
No.
You know, I mean, to every great face, you need that heel, and he fit in that heel.
Yeah, and you know, he did some great stuff in the whole decade. The dog collar match at Starrcade against Greg the Hammer Valentine, really great, hard-hitting, brutal match, bloody as all hell. His match against Adrian Adonis on WrestleMania 3 is a match that's overlooked, but it was a great match. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed it. He retired in '87, but came back I think a year or two later. But the guy, I mean, if he would have stayed solid all the way through, he probably would have been a little bit higher on this list.
Sure. So now, number 4 is one of the greatest of all time. What can you say about him? Randy Savage, one of the best workers in the business. Great interviews, even though you couldn't understand half the shit he said, but he made you understand it.
What do you mean you can't understand me?
You know, it's a shame that he's not in the Hall of Fame, and I just heard today that They're not still going to put him in the Hall of Fame in 2013 because his
of
brother
Leaping Lanny Poffo.
And they want to put Lanny wants him and his dad to go in with Randy. Bullshit on that. Randy deserves to be in there, and I think that's just greedy on their part.
Yeah. Well, that's the only way that Lanny Poffo is even going to think about being in the Hall of Fame, because honestly, he was a glorified jobber.
He was.
I mean, even when he was a manager for Perfect, he wasn't nothing.
No, he was a perfect stooge the whole time.
Yeah.
But with Savage, he was a true ring general.
Did he have his own jacket?
No, he wasn't like Christopher Daniels. But the thing is, I mean, he was methodical in his matches. I heard that he would go with the guys he was wrestling with the night right before they get in the ring and go over the whole match. And you couldn't tell that with the way he wrestled.
Again, like we spoke with earlier about Steamboat, he was the guy in WrestleMania 3 had one of the greatest WrestleMania matches of all time. And, next WrestleMania he wins the championship. He seamlessly switched from heel to face and then back to heel with the Mega Powers and then back to face again with the Match Made in Heaven, Match Made in Hell at, what was it, SummerSlam 88? 87?
Yeah.
88, I think it was. Maybe 89. I don't remember which SummerSlam it was, but he ended up getting back with Elizabeth. The whole Mega Powers thing was huge. I think if it wasn't for Hogan's ego, Savage probably would have been a bigger star than Hogan, because Savage was every bit as popular, 10 times as good in the ring, and just as good of an interview as Hogan, in my opinion.
Well, the thing about Savage is he could work with anybody and make a great match.
Yeah.
Look at the match he did with the Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania 7. I mean, that was probably one of the best matches of all times, top 10 list at least. And that was with the Ultimate Warrior.
Yeah.
I mean, that's saying something.
Randy Savage is, and it's something you hear that they talk about with Randy Orton. Randy Savage, if you dreamed up a wrestler in the 1980s, what they were going to look like, sound like, act like, they'd be Randy Savage.
Exactly.
I mean, he was absolutely perfect. Not to rip on your guy, but...
Yeah.
And now our number 3 guy was the absolute opposite of having...
I was going to say that.
having the perfect look or perfect anything, and that was... Our number 3 guy is Dusty Rhodes. Now, the guy came in, he had probably my physique, if not a little bit worse. And he was just... Dusty Rhodes would talk you into the building. He could talk you out of your seats to buy the tickets to see him wrestle Ric Flair, wrestle Ted DiBiase, wrestle Ivan Koloff, Nikita Koloff, wrestle against the Road Warriors. I mean, the guy was constantly a top draw everywhere he went. And he was a guy, that got over when really he didn't have any of the looks that any of the other guys in the 80s had.
Well, the thing is, he had that talking, the charisma, that talking ability, where you wanted to be behind Dusty Rhodes.
Yeah.
You wanted him to win that match.
He's just a common man.
Exactly, the son of a plumber.
Working hard with his hands.
Are you going to do his dance in Sapphire? Anyway, I mean, he was one of those guys that could take lemons and turn into lemonade. Speaking of the polka dots, who else could get polka dots over?
And, very underrated during that time. His feud with the Big Boss Man was a tremendous feud. The Big Boss Man doesn't quite get the respect he deserves for how good he was. Dusty Rhodes and Big Boss Man had a great feud in the WWF. A lot of people shit on Dusty's time in WWF, but he had some good feuds there. The one with DiBiase, the ones with Boss Man. And that's not including the stuff he did in NWA. I think his feud with Tully Blanchard is one of the best feuds of the 80s, let alone his feud with Ric Flair.
Mm-hmm. Now, talk about one of the biggest stars of the 80s. Got to mention a man we've already talked about a few times, Hulk Hogan. Now, take away from your feelings the way he acts or his backstage politics. Hogan was the biggest draw, one of the biggest draws of the 1980s.
Yeah.
Arguably the biggest draw.
One of the first guys to break over mainstream media. He was in Rocky III, had his own movies at the time, and he was a guy that could host Saturday Night Live way before anybody else did.
Yes, and the thing is, he didn't have a lot of wrestling ability.
No.
He just could talk, and there was just something about him, because he really wasn't the best talker of all time either.
No.
It's just, it's just that little bit of magic that you have sometimes. I hate saying it like that, but it's true.
He had the it factor.
Yeah. Not Robbie Roode. Or Bobby Roode, but he was the it factor.
I mean, if you think about it, he main evented in AWA, He should have probably won their world title. He was the man in WWF when WWF was as hot as it ever was in the 80s, and he was the guy that was on top. I mean, we talk bad about Hulk Hogan a lot, and we talk bad about Hulk Hogan of the 2010s. But Hulk Hogan of the 80s, I'm sure he was a piece of shit, drug addict, steroid abuser. All that aside, the guy was what most of you people that are in our age group or younger either got into wrestling seeing Hulk Hogan and wanting to be like Hulk Hogan, or wanting to see your guy beat Hulk Hogan. Which is I got into wrestling because I liked Roddy Piper. I seen Roddy Piper, and that's what drew me in, and I wanted to see him beat Hulk Hogan. Even as a kid, I thought that Roddy Piper was a way more interesting character.
Now, before we get to the number one, we're going to give you the best of rest, and these aren't in any specific order. These are just some of the guys that just didn't quite make it to the top 10.
Our first guy on the best of rest was the Iron Sheik, the guy that ended Bob Backlund's run. Basically, he was a transitional champion between Backlund and Hogan, but he still was a main event talent, won that title, won the tag title. I mean, the guy he's batshit crazy now, but he was a tremendous worker in the time.
Next would be Jerry Lawler, one of the biggest draw in Memphis history. He actually beat everybody on our top 10 list.
Yeah, exactly.
I can't think of a person he didn't beat. Just a phenomenal draw there. I mean, he was legitimately the king of Memphis.
And the only thing that stops him from being in our top 10 is the fact that he never went anywhere other than Memphis, in the 80s at least.
No. And the thing is with him, his feud with Andy Kaufman really put wrestling on the map in certain areas.
Yeah. Now, our next guy is a guy, Andre the Giant, who was bigger in the 70s, still big into the 80s, but his career dwindled down so hard. I mean, he did the WrestleMania 3 main event. You notice a lot of these guys were on the WrestleMania 3 card.
Oh, yeah.
But he was in the WrestleMania 3 main event, but in my opinion, he was much better in the 70s than he was in the 80s.
Now, next we're going to talk about Magnum TA. It was a crying shame that the man's career ended so short and abrupt. I mean, they were grooming him to be their version of Hulk Hogan in the NWA.
And he had every bit of a following to do it. He was so over, it wasn't even funny. He was just as over as our next guy, who could have been Texas's Hulk Hogan or even the WWE's Hulk Hogan. I thought at a time when the next guy's Kerry Von Erich, I thought when they brought him in, he was a replacement for the Ultimate Warrior. That's what it seemed to me, in my opinion.
Next, we're going to talk about one of the greatest guys from the 70s and in the 80s and into the 90s.
And even the 2000s.
Exactly. Terry Funk. This man here has revolutionized different genres of wrestling. He actually went in the 90s and made
ECW.
He legitimized ECW. He was one of their biggest draws they had there for the times that he was there. But during the 80s, him and Flair had some of the best matches that you could dream of.
And another guy that we didn't even put on their board, but it just came to my mind, a big, huge draw was the Junkyard Dog. One of the guys that broke through the color barrier, one of the first guys that break the color barrier in wrestling and be a huge draw in the Deep South as a black man. I mean, it was great what he was doing, and he didn't really get to do it as much in WWE. He was always below Hulk Hogan, but he still had a big, great following.
Well, I want to add one more to it, too, then.
Okay.
And we mentioned his name earlier. He was big in the 90s, but Big Boss Man. I mean, he was one of the, he started off as kind of a,
Big Bubba Rogers.
Well, even in WWE, he started off as kind of as a heel with him and Akeem the African Dream. But when he turned baby faces, he was one of the bigger mid-card baby faces in the company.
Boss Man doesn't get the respect he deserves, and we'll talk about that some other time on another show. But before we get into our number one guy, if you guys have any opinion on this, if you think we did the order wrong, if there was somebody we left off, or you just don't agree with us at all, let us know what you think. Hit us up on Facebook, hit us up on Twitter, put it down where?
Down there.
Put it right down there in the comments. Jesus
Hold on, wait for it. Alright, good. Couldn't see it no more, it went so far.
Now our number one guy, if you paid any attention, you know that there's only one guy left. You throw up the four fingers, the Nature Boy Ric Flair.
Arguably the greatest of all time.
I would say any conversation about the greatest wrestler of all time has to begin with Nature Boy Ric Flair. I mean, what can you say about the guy? The guy was money. everywhere he went, he made money. He kept the NWA afloat, and he made the NWA a strong competitor with the WWE.
Oh, exactly. The man would defend the title anywhere and everywhere.
Yeah.
And it was good because he could legitimately keep the belt. If he went somewhere where they were trying to shoot and take the belt from him, he could actually shoot too. And a lot of people don't really realize that.
Well, think about it, like you said with Lawler. Think about the guys on our list. I mean, in the 80s, he beat Arn Anderson. He beat Ted DiBiase. He's beat Steamboat. He beat Perfect. He beat Savage. He beat Piper. He beat Dusty Rhodes. I mean, at Magnum TA, Kerry Von Erich, Terry Funk. I mean, all the other guys on our list.
Hogan.
Well, that was a different decade. But I'm just saying, strictly in the 80s, most of the guys on our list were beaten by Ric Flair, and that includes guys like Harley Race that he beat, the guy that pretty much passed the torch on to him, and he took it and ran with it and took it to heights that it hadn't ever been before. If it wasn't for bad money management by the Crockett's, NWA would still be around, and that's kind of the problem. They didn't have the business sense that Vince McMahon had. They had a better product, wrestling-wise, but they didn't have the sense to market it and what to pay the guys.
It's true.
But nothing really you can't say. Like I said, any list that you have about the 80s or greatest wrestler of all time has to begin with Ric Flair.
I totally agree, or he wouldn't be there.
Exactly. Anything else you got to say on this, GR?
I think we're good.
Well, my name's George Coles.
Gary Rhodes.
And this has been a Heel Heat Top 10.